Phil Coffey is the Coffey in Coffey Architects, a practice he started 16 years ago, which now has a strong profile of work across a wide range of sectors, including some overseas projects. So, Phil, can we start by telling me about your approach to your architecture and how it differentiates itself from that of your peers?
Architecture for me is about building buildings, not just about talking. It's about actually making things, and it takes time to make things, you know. And sometimes you kind of get devastated by the lack of built work that you've done when you've been doing it for 15 years. But you know, in that sense, I like to think of architecture or where we are in that, and think about it hard about where we've come from, what we've done, and where we're going. And I think there's something in that which is kind of at the moment the great shifts in architecture happen in social change and in material change, and we're going through both of those now in a sense, through climate and environment. And so, you know, whilst it's not a USP, it's something that I care passionately about for a number of reasons that we can discuss. And so really, I think concentrating on the environment and our way of exploring is the thing that we are doing now and have done since we started. The way that we explore projects is through light, and a thick understanding about what we did, you know, before we were conscious of what we were doing, I suppose. Now that we're conscious of it, what changes are we making to make those new projects, and what would we like to do in the future? There's a kind of, I think you probably know, but I'm a bit of a passionate photographer as well as an architect, and really through the education and passion of both architecture and photography, that kind of leads to a way of thinking about the projects that we're doing now, you know, from Cardiff 27 years ago to taking photographs of my father for as long as I can remember and talking about light in a technical sense, but also in a kind of an experiential sense. I think it's nice to think about architecture in a way that isn't just about the science, it's also about the art. And as a photographer, it's a lovely thing, as you're very humbled and very, how would one describe, very attracted to the idea of being with the sun. So, you know, I was on the Isle of Skye 3 or 4 months ago, waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning to walk up to the Old Man of Store, to be there by myself to watch the sunrise and catch the light at the right moment. And every piece of architecture we make, I think, is about that feeling, that kind of transcendental feeling. So you take it to a slightly different place. So the buildings that we're working at the moment, now that we're conscious of that kind of sense of experience and that sense of, or trying to make a place that isn't necessarily designed by the architect, it's something slightly more than that. And I think that's about kind of the passion and the way that one thinks about making an architecture, rather than actually thinking about the aesthetic. It's actually about the experience. And on the back side of that is a question about, we're all talking about well-being now. And I think well-being is directly connected to light. So in a way, it seems to me that things are coming around after many, many years of maybe thinking about architecture with an old man's head, dare I say it. That actually, you know, people's been stuck in their homes during COVID have made them much more connected to their environment. And having traveled the world, fortunately, and been to many countries, one of the things that I've always thought is that the more connected you are to your environment, the more you care for it. And I think we see that now with everybody. And I think it's a great opportunity, or a wonderful opportunity for architecture to actually reconnect with the simple things in architecture. And that starts for me with the sun, the movement of the sun, how we respond to daylight. And in a sense, that can affect concentration, it can affect our health, and it can certainly affect our well-being. There are issues to do with vitamin D, of course, deficiency, issues to do around jet lag, shift work. We all know what light can do to us and how it can make us feel. You know, you could use the example of Las Vegas and never getting out of a casino and the way that makes you feel, versus, you know, being on the top of a mountain on the Isle of Skye. So I think, you know, if you look at the polarities, it's kind of easy to understand why architecture can affect your health and well-being, and how one then manipulates that to make an architecture of health and well-being, which is actually good for the environment because it makes you care for it. So between all of those things, I think, despite all the horrible things that have happened during COVID, I think there's some really interesting and promising directions that may come out of it, which architects can plug into. Maybe one thing that is a USP for us is that we like to use wit in architecture. The idea that somehow, and I don't necessarily mean humour, but in the sense you don't want to be funny with architecture, but if you can work against the tide or make people look, I think that's an interesting way to approach architecture. If you want people to be conscious of their environment, then you need to make them look or observe. And there's this wonderful thing with circadian rhythms, which of course is the way that we react to light and react to architecture. Well, there's a Zeitgeber. I should have mentioned, I went to Cardiff a long time ago, and now I'm doing a PhD in light and well-being with them. So it's kind of come full circle, and we're doing this in practice. So it's we're instilling processes and ideas and language within the office in order to kind of explore some of these ideas. But a Zeitgeber is one of those moments where it's a kind of it's a trigger for your circadian rhythm. You have it internal, but it's an external trigger. And those Zeitgebers can be activity, they can be eating food. There are other Zeitgebers, but architecture, in a sense, for me, a Zeitgeber is noticing time, it's noticing light. It's all the things that many people have spoken about before, but maybe I'm just framing it in a slightly different sense. For instance, at the Science Museum, we use digital shadows. Hidden House, one of our projects, we use zenith light for calmness, depth of light at the BFI to suggest scale. But all of these things are kind of, they're not the norm. And I think there's a sense that there's something else going on. But again, it's not, I don't think it's necessarily an ostentatious or something to do with the architect. It's actually just manipulating what you have and using light as a free material, which you can in a way manipulate to give people a feeling.
So are you greatly influenced by the modernists of particularly the interwar period, who were their architecture is very much driven by response to unhealthy 19th century cities, light, air, health, and also, of course, issues around tuberculosis and other key health issues which were very prominent at the time.
Without doubt, I think I'm of that age when people like Richard Weston taught me, and Izzy Metstein taught me. And I traveled the west coast of America. I've been very fortunate to travel and see a lot of seminal architecture, and an awful lot of that is Kahn, Frank Lloyd Wright, Alto, Corbusier, those kinds of later architects, I think. But they had the same. There's a question in modernism to do with like letting the outside in, which in essence was about recognizing that connection to landscape, connection to horizon, connection to zenith light is in itself health bearing. And I think there is a conversation there, which is what is contemporary architecture in terms of that constant change in the question of enclosure and how you allow light and allow view out. We always talk about the long and the tall view in architecture. So this idea that you can see a long way and you can see a long way up. And in some ways, architecture is just this. I feel very humbled in a way. Light takes 8 minutes, 20 seconds to get to our planet. And we, as architects, we get to make shadow, or we get to make apertures, because the whole world's full of light. It's just that we put stuff in the way. As Ian Ritchie used to say, he used to call it light, shadows are just holes in light, which I always thought was one of my favorite quotes. And so there is that, the sense that you have to take it incredibly seriously, no matter what you make or how small it is or how big it is, and whatever scales we're working at, whether it be a small house or a house extension or 400,000 square foot in China, all of those things are then driven by those preoccupations, I think.
So what are the sort of key projects you're working on at the moment?
We're really fortunate because whether it be for good or for bad, we decided early on that I have a passion for architecture, not a passion for sectors. And so if a project is interesting, then we like to work on a project. And if it's a client who we can work with, who are interested. I'm not talking about big budgets either. I'm talking about an ambition to make something that's interesting. We've got, at the moment, we're working on a couple of cultural projects. We've got London Irish Centre, which is on Camden Square, which we've just received unanimous planning for. Interestingly, that's what's super interesting about that project. Well, personally, I've discovered that I'm 5th generation Irish from Crusheen near to Limerick, so that's made my day. I always feel at home amongst the Irish, and Liverpool and Manchester, where I'm from. But what's interesting about that project is the conversation about immigrant communities into Camden. And it's not just about the Irish, it's actually a good example of an immigrant population moving into a place and actually making a success of it. And what's beautiful about the site and the location, apart from it being on Camden Square, is that when people arrived from Ireland, they came across on the boat and then on the train into Euston. And there's a kind of a story of 2 suitcases, because the reason everybody went to Camden is because it's the furthest you could get from Euston whilst carrying 2 suitcases, which is kind of sweet. But we use that story with light and that narrative to design the building, because the corner within which the building sits faces due south, but that is also directly aligned with Euston. So that corner became incredibly important to us. And now for a moment on St. Patrick's Day, the light comes through at a particular time, and we'll do something inside yet to be agreed. But it's that moment in time which represents the movement of people into Camden and specifically locates the project, both culturally but geographically within the conversation, which we really, really love. And another interesting fact about the project is we designed the cultural space, or the main bar, if you like, around just a very simple semicircle, which is for 2 people. And of course, that's where community starts. You have one person, that's one person. If you have 2 people sat together, then conversation starts and there's community. And so then they grow, but then they form a pattern on the floor, which is actually 32 segments. And there's 32 boroughs of London, and there's 32 provinces, if you like, of Ireland, the whole of Ireland. And so it's a rather lovely thing for the London Irish Centre to work through pattern and through light to make a space that has meaning. We're also working on the Tannery Arts, which is part of a mixed-use scheme with U&I down in Southwark. That is, we're just playing with Northlight there, trying to understand that a little better. Education, quite interesting. We're working on a Digitech factory in Norwich for Norwich City College, which is about layering of light. It's a totally white building, white outside, white inside, and we're just playing with the idea that we can play with shadow and depth rather than material itself. There's a number of reasons for that, budget one, but also two, just in terms of kind of trying to play a game which is to do with colour or lack of colour and shades of grey rather than materiality, which is not something that we've done before. You may have seen our building at Handyside Street, 22 Handyside Street. I don't know if you've seen it yet, but that's a building all about light and about concentration and about not only light inside the building, but also light outside the building, how you reflect light. You know, that idea that there are several types of reflection or shadow, the one that kind of you cast a shadow onto something or onto itself, or the shading around it. What I find, the bright building that we've designed is really interesting as a gateway, because it really does shine at certain times of day. But it also lights up that street on the south side. It reflects the light into it. And I think it's something really interesting about the reflection of buildings into public realm. I get kind of tired of this idea that public realm is just trees and a slight widening of the pavement, when actually the reflection and the way buildings suck light and the idea of orientation is super, super important to public realm and the way buildings relate to it in terms of the sun. What else are we doing? Yeah, so we're working. So on the back of that, we're now working with British Land, interesting, on a wellbeing centre at 10 Exchange Square. So it's our first kind of, we're dipping our toe into the city. But what we've designed there is there's a big, large space designed by SOM, which is a classic 1990s outside staircase, inside staircase to get up to the platform, which is Broadgate itself up on the level. But we have, that space wasn't used very well. So we've now filled that space, and you'll like this, Peter. We filled that space with cycle storage. We suggested that we should have cycle storage and a wellbeing centre, i.e. place to do yoga, but also to several showers. And what that's about is a world-class welcome for cyclists, not just for pedestrians. And I think what's interesting about that, there's a whole kind of bunch of repercussions in the sense that, for me, not going into a basement is great for many reasons, because, you know, who wants to go next to the cars when you've just had a lovely cycle into the office? But more importantly, why go into a dark space when you've been up, you feel fresh, you feel bright, and now all of a sudden you're in the depths? It's not a nice way to start the day. So, you know, there's a nice daylit, all of the shower spaces, all of the entrance spaces are daylit. So you don't have that break in light for your circadian rhythm as you arrive. But then that leads to other further conversations, which maybe not so much to do with light, or they are in the end, is that when you're talking about kind of fabric first and thinking about knocking building down or building more environmentally, building basements is a really terrible thing to be doing, you know, in terms of the amount of energy that they use. And we build basements to put cars in or to put bikes in, which seems to me a bit back to front. And we probably do all of that because we've got to keep the height down. And I think it's really interesting the way that you can think about architecture and kind of, you know, going from small buildings up to kind of urban design. Why aren't we building taller, building buildings closer together? Because, you know, in 50 years, some of these buildings, well, many of these buildings will still be around. And these buildings will need to shade each other by that point, because we'll be living in a much hotter city. So, you know, there's a relationship to height, to basement, to energy use, which I think is worth considering. You know, if you were to add an extra 2 stories to the buildings but didn't dig any basements, maybe that wouldn't be such a problem. Housing, we are completing 110 homes for Croydon, for Brick by Brick. It's been excellent. They've been a really brilliant client, and it's a shame to see what's happening at the moment, but I hope that they can continue in some guise, because, you know, their ambition and their optimism is something to be applauded. There we're just exploring modern methods of construction, building lightweight timber structures and putting lightweight cladding on them. I always find it very odd building lightweight timber structures and then putting brick on them. I just think it's a bit back to front. So we're using tile hung, we're using fibre cement, and we're using zinc. Did I say zinc already? Zinc. And using different colors to break up the elevation, but on a very simple level to do with light. We've got a clear story in all of the houses, so there's an awful lot of light in all of those houses, and normally on 2 sides as well, which makes a distinct difference into how you feel about the space.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Phil, for your insights and sharing your experience with me. So good to see you, and hope to see you in the flesh soon.
Indeed, nice to see you, Peter.